Greetings, gentle viewers. This is George from Ireland. I'm continuing my series about History GCSE, looking at the international relations option. In this video, I shall outline some of the failures of the League of Nations in the 1930s. Notably, in 1935, the Italian government declared war on Abyssinia, and the League of Nations proved powerless to resolve that situation. In 1938, Austria was annexed by Germany. Then the Sudetenland, which was part of Czechoslovakia, was also seized by Germany, and the League of Nations was unable to sort out the situation. In 1939, the Third Reich, that's Germany, invaded Poland, and that sparked off the Second World War. The League of Nations did not even bother to discuss the invasion of Poland. On that day, the League of Nations was busy engaged in seeking to harmonise rail gauges in different European countries, something which is worth doing, but would obviously help any aggressor, because having conquered a different country, one could then use one's own trains on that gauge. I'm not saying that's why the League of Nations was doing it. The League of Nations turned out to be more of a failure than its success. It's lugubrious to reflect. It was able to contain wrongdoing by minor countries, but it lacked the willpower and the military muscle to take serious actions against mighty countries that bullied their neighbours, and these shortcomings became ever more apparent as time went on. The League was feeble from its outset. It was not necessarily foredoomed to a complete failure. Many people, though, thought that wrongdoing seemed to be rewarded with an endless stream of concessions, and countries began to lose faith in the League of Nations. It was not fit for purpose. It appeared politique for minor nations to be under the aegis of mightier countries. Anyway, the power block system of the 19th century returned. After 1929, politics became more extreme, into the Great Depression, and the League of Nations was doomed. So what were the reasons for the League of Nations' failure to live up to the fond hopes of its founders? Well, the United States was not in it. The Soviet Union was also absent until 1934. The burden of enforcing the will of the League of Nations fell on war-sick nations such as France and the United Kingdom. So the American contribution, had it been there, would have made a major difference, perhaps the crucial difference with her military prowess, or particularly the US Navy. The US Army was actually quite small back then. France and the United Kingdom were overburdened. They were striving to confront their domestic travails. They had to contend with mass unemployment, fractious colonies, and war debt. So because they were very short of money, they scrimped on defence. Anti-war feeling was so pronounced the governments were exceedingly reluctant to embark on punitive measures against aggressor nations, even when there was moral clarity behind such an action. There was a growing body of opinion that the Paris peace treaties, particularly Versailles, had been conceived in a spirit of vengeance and were unduly hard on Germany. Britishers felt guilty about this and decided not to enforce the treaties, and that seemed to be at just the wrong time. The League of Nations was popular in the UK. There was an organisation called the League of Nations Union. They held a vote to see if British people would unconditionally reject war, and millions of them did. It was an unofficial referendum. The Oxford Union Society, which is a debating society of Oxford University, held a debate in 1933. This house would under no circumstances fight for king and country. The motion was carried. The next week there was an attempt by Randolph Churchill, the son of Winston Churchill, to have the Oxford Union reverse its decision and direct the secretary to strike the motion from the record, almost pretend as though the debate hadn't taken place. He thought he could reverse the decision, but he failed. The motion was reaffirmed. So pacifist feeling was intense and very widespread. A man who claimed to be a member of the German General Staff wrote to some British newspaper in the 60s that this pusillanimous attitude of the British ruling class had been taken note of in Germany at the time, and it had a profound influence on the calculations of Adolf Hitler. It convinced him that the British had no spinal column. and then could be pushed around. The League of Nations sanctions were ineffective. The sanctions would not influence the United States since the USA was not a member. An aggressive nation could trade with the US. So League of Nations countries were very reluctant to impose sanctions because they were missing out on trade, and say the other countries will cheat on it. So sanctions busting would be rife. So League of Nations countries were suffering severely owing to the Great Depression of the 30s, and they're unwilling to make their economic predicament even worse by agreeing to sanctions. They're suffering enough misery as it was. Abyssinia is the clearest example of this. The League of Nations Assembly met but annually. Unanimous decisions had to be reached for action. Therefore, decisiveness was all but unheard of, and meaningless words, waffle, indecision were the default position. It was exceedingly difficult to get everyone to agree, even the most unreasonable governments. Agreements were therefore so open-ended in their wording that they were virtually pointless. Watered down any action, or sometimes negotiations, were so protracted that by the time a decision was arrived at, the propitious moment for action had passed. Sometimes a situation can be solved if one acts fast, but they never did. The League of Nations didn't have a military. It was going to have to rely on its member states to use their military on League of Nations missions. Most of them were very war-averse after the First World War. Governments were very hesitant about committing to military action. The League of Nations was therefore powerless. The impact of the Wall Street crash. 1929, that's when it happened, led to the Great Depression. Many countries were very dependent on US loans, on trade with the United States. The stock market collapsed, and this had a very deleterious impact on the rest of the world. The repercussions of this propelled authoritarian governments into office. The Soviet Union, which didn't do much trade with the rest of the world, was largely insulated from the Great Depression because their government was starving millions of their people to death already, and as they did after the Great Depression. Many businesses folded in capitalist countries. Many people lost their jobs. Those who had jobs often had their hours of pay, or hours of work cut, or their hourly rate of pay cut. They were frightened they were going to lose their jobs altogether. Governments became more aggressive. Germany, the Japanese and Italian regimes likewise. And some countries such as France and the UK became more isolationists. But let's look at some of the aggressive governments of the 30s. The Japanese government became more fascistic and openly militaristic. The National Socialists, or Nazis, were elected to office in Germany in 1933. Nazi foreign policy was Schlummerlied, first of all, which is literally slumber song, singing a lullaby to her neighbours, persuading them to calm down. There's absolutely nothing to worry about, and we have no aggressive intentions towards you. The Germans did not have the military means to run the risk of war in the early 30s. They did by 1939. Germany was even worried that Poland might attack her. In 1934, she signed a 10-year non-aggression pact with Poland. Hitler was uncertain of his domestic position. He had many internal problems to face. The president was still there, who could have sacked Hitler at any time. After a few years, Hitler grew in confidence, and his military was massively beefed up. Every time he broke the terms of Versailles, the Allies just rolled over and accepted it. Therefore, he was emboldened, and so he was testing the resolve of the Allies and seeing what he could get away with more and more and more, so it transpired. Italy had been in fascist hands since 1922, and she grew more expansionist. The Great Depression caused a spike in unemployment. Mussolini wanted to settle impecunious Italians overseas in Libya and so forth. He wished to gain access to raw materials and captive markets for Italian manufactures. He thought that a brief and glorious war would be just the panacea that the public needed in view of their economic pain. In 1931, Japanese attacked China and seized the province of Manchuria. In 1935, Italy invaded Abyssinia, we now call it Ethiopia, and I've already outlined what happened with regard to Austria, the Sudetenland, rest of Czechoslovakia and Poland. So these countries, Japan, Italy and Germany, they all withdrew from the League of Nations, and they said they were no longer bound by its rules since they were no longer members. In 1936, they'd formed the Anti-Comintern Pact. Comintern's Communist International. It was an organization based in Moscow. The Soviet Union wished to evangelize for communism all around the world, and to bring communist governments to office in every country, possibly by peaceful means and possibly by violent revolution. In reality, the anti-Comintern Pact was more against Western democracies than it was against the Soviet Union.